does a cracked boiler seam sound like 5 minutes before it kills 58 people? I went looking for the answer in an engineering study published in the April 1905 issue of the Engineer's Review, and what I found was not the sound. It was a woman standing at a kitchen window. Her name was Mrs. David Rockwell. Her husband was the chief engineer at the R.B. Grover Shoe Factory in Brockton, Massachusetts. He had a first-class engineer's license and 12 years of experience operating steam boilers in industrial plants. On the morning of March 20th, 1905, at approximately 7:45 in the morning, Mrs. Rockwell looked out the window of the house she shared with her husband, roughly 100 feet from the boiler room, and saw him sitting in a wooden chair near the boiler house window, his hands clasped behind his head. He had checked the fires, he had checked the water gauge, he had checked the steam pressure, he had spoken with his assistant. Everything was in order. He was resting. 5 minutes later, the boiler exploded with a force that engineers would later estimate at 660 pounds of dynamite. It rocketed upward through 3 floors and the roof of a 4-story wooden factory building. The building collapsed. The floors pancaked. Gas lines ruptured. The coals from the boiler's fire pit scattered across the wreckage and ignited a structure whose wooden floors had been treated every night with linseed oil to keep the shoe dust down. Then 2 sheds full of naphtha, a volatile solvent related to gasoline, caught fire and exploded, showering hundreds of gallons of flaming liquid across the ruins and driving every rescuer back from the wreckage. 58 people died. 150 were injured. 39 of the dead could not be identified because the fire had burned hot enough to reduce human remains to calcium powder and teeth. They were buried together in a single ceremony at Brockton's Melrose Cemetery 3 days later. The city erected a monument. The names that could be determined were inscribed on it. The ones that could not were not. A search of the boiler room the next day turned up a charred body, a bent watch, 2 rubber heels, and a torn piece of clothing. Mrs. Rockwell identified the clothing as her husband's. That was how they found David Rockwell. Not by his face, not by his hands, by a scrap of fabric and a watch that had stopped. The cause of the explosion was a crack in a lap joint seam of a 14-year-old backup boiler that no inspector on Earth could have seen. It was hiding between 2 overlapping plates of steel, growing wider with every heating cycle, invisible from the outside, invisible from the inside, waiting for the morning that David Rockwell lit the fires and put it back to work. Brockton, Massachusetts, in 1905, was the shoe capital of the United States. 35,000 shoe workers lived in a city of roughly 70,000 people. The factories lined the streets of the Campello district on the south end of town, brick and wooden buildings standing shoulder to shoulder, producing boots and shoes for a national market that consumed them by the millions. The R.B. Grover Company made the Emerson brand, a popular mid-priced shoe sold through a chain of more than 30 retail stores scattered across the country. The company's founder, Robbins B. Grover, had gotten his start making shoes for Union soldiers during the Civil War. By 1905, business had been good enough that Grover had added a 4th floor to his factory at the corner of Main and Calmer Streets. The building was wooden, shaped like the letter E, and it covered nearly half a city block. 300 to 400 workers reported each day. Most of the production floor workers were young women and girls who operated stitching machines on the upper floors. When the 4th floor went on, the original boiler was replaced by a larger, more powerful unit capable of handling the increased heating load. The old boiler, built in 1890 or 1891, depending on which account you read, 17 feet long and 6 feet in diameter, was left in place as a backup. It sat in a brick boiler house attached to the wooden factory at the crossbar of the letter E. Since the new boiler could generally meet the factory's needs on its own, the old one was seldom used, and when it was used reluctantly. That detail comes from David Rockwell's own wife. In the days after the explosion, Mrs. Rockwell told investigators that her husband had been irritable for several days because he had to operate the old boiler at a pressure it was unequal to. He did not trust it. He had not trusted it for months. He had told her so. But the new boiler needed its regular maintenance. It had worked hard through a cold New England winter, and the flushing could not be put off any longer. Someone had had to heat the building and keep the factory running while the new boiler was down. The old boiler was all they had. There was no third option. There was no rental. There was no temporary replacement. It was the old boiler or shut the factory down. And shutting the factory down was not a decision the chief engineer had the authority to make. Rockwell ordered the night watchman to light the fires in the old boiler early on Sunday morning, March 19th, a full day before the workers arrived, so that it would have 24 hours to warm up slowly and limit the thermal stress on the pipes, fittings, and joints. He was being methodical. He was being careful. He was a man with 12 years of experience and a first-class license, doing the responsible thing with the only equipment he had. The equipment had a crack inside it, and that crack had been growing since before he was hired. On Monday morning, March 20th, Rockwell arrived at the plant at 7:25 in the morning and found the old boiler firing well. It had warmed slowly over the weekend, exactly as planned. The water gauge showed adequate water in the shell. The steam pressure was set at 80 pounds per square inch, 10 pounds below the boiler's rated capacity of 90. His friend, an engineer at the city's sewer plant, had stopped by for a quick chat. Channing Howard, the head of the shipping department, dropped off a borrowed oil can. It was a normal morning. It was the kind of morning when everything looked right and nothing suggested trouble. At 7:45 in the morning, the plant manager telephoned the boiler room to ask about strange noises coming from the radiators along one wall of the factory. Rockwell had just stepped outside. His assistant, who was in the boiler room, assured the manager that everything was in order. The strange noises were noted. They were not investigated further. A few minutes later, the boiler let go. I need to explain what a lap joint is, because the failure mode is the entire story. A lap joint boiler is constructed from curved steel plates that are formed into cylindrical sections and then fastened together. Where two plates meet, they overlap each other by several inches. The overlapping edges are pressed tight against each other and held in compression by rows of steel rivets driven through both layers. It is a simple design. It is cheap to manufacture. It was the most common boiler construction in the United States for decades. In 1905, there were tens of thousands of lap joint boilers operating in factories, mills, power plants, laundries, and apartment buildings across the country. The design had one flaw that could not be inspected away, could not be maintained away, and could not be engineered away with the materials and methods of the era. If a crack forms in the edge of one plate where it is overlapped by the other, the crack is hidden between the two layers of steel. An inspector can examine the inside surface of the boiler shell. He can examine the outside surface. He can tap the plates with a hammer and listen for the dull sound that indicates a flaw. He can pressurize the boiler to its rated capacity and watch for leaks or deformation, but he cannot see between the plates. He cannot slide a gauge into the overlap. He cannot separate the riveted joint without destroying the boiler. The crack grows in a space that is, by the geometry of the design itself, invisible, and it grows every time the boiler heats and cools. Every thermal cycle expands the metal, then contracts it. The crack widens by thousandths of an inch, then thousandths more, over months, over years, until the remaining sound metal at the edge of the plate cannot hold the steam pressure anymore, and the joint lets go, and the full energy of the pressurized steam inside the boiler is released in a fraction of a second. That's what happened at 7:50 in the morning on March 20th, 1905. The Hartford Boiler Insurance Company employed some of the best inspectors in the country. Hartford's business model depended on it. They insured boilers against explosion, and every explosion they prevented was a claim they did not have to pay. They inspected the Grover factory's boilers regularly. They had checked the interior of the old boiler about 1 year before the explosion. They checked its exterior just a month before. Each year, across their entire portfolio of insured boilers, Hartford's inspectors found thousands of cracks and ordered repairs. They were good at their job. They found nothing wrong with the Grover boiler, because there was nothing to find on any surface they could reach. On the outside of the boiler shell, a label certified that the steel used in its construction could withstand pressures of up to 60,000 pounds per square inch. The boiler was operating at 80 pounds per square inch. The steel was strong, the rivets were sound, the water level was correct, the pressure was below rated capacity, the engineer was experienced and cautious, and the crack was between the plates where nobody could look. C.E. Roberts, a manager at Hartford Steam Boiler, said after the explosion that, so far as he had been able to learn, there appeared to have been no carelessness in the handling of the boiler. The explosion, in his opinion, was caused by a defect that was impossible to discover. Those are his words, impossible to discover. When the riveted plates let go, one end of the boiler tore away from its stanchions and blew completely through the factory wall. It careened through the Rockwell house, tearing off the roof while sparing Mrs. Rockwell, and smashed into the house next door, punching a hole in the wall. Hannah Hood, the occupant, was unhurt but badly shaken. The boiler itself, or the larger section of it, rocketed upward through the factory, through 3 floors and the roof, carrying wooden beams and joists and machinery and debris with it like a projectile. At the far end of the building, the flying wreckage struck the base of an elevated water tower. The tower's full tank, thousands of gallons of water, smashed through the roof and crashed down through the collapsing floors below. That end of the building came down immediately. The floors pancaked, one onto the next, compressing the workers and the machinery they had been operating into a compacted mass of wood and iron and human bodies in the basement. Between 300 and 400 workers were inside the factory when it blew. Many of them were women and girls on the upper stitching floors. The ones in the section of the building still standing escaped down stairways or climbed to the roof, where they were pulled to safety by civilians who had arrived with ladders from the surrounding streets. Some workers jumped from windows because the blast had knocked fire escapes off the side of the building. One stitcher on the top floor reported that the floor collapsed beneath her, and she fell through all 4 stories, landed in the wreckage, and crawled out onto the ground. She survived. About 100 workers escaped unharmed. 150 were injured. A number who were only slightly hurt went home without reporting and were never counted in the official tally. The fire started within seconds of the collapse. Burning coals from the boiler's fire pit, thrown outward by the force of the explosion, landed throughout the debris. They landed on broken wooden beams and joists. They landed on bolts of leather and cases of shoe findings. They landed on floors that had been treated every night with linseed oil to suppress dust. The oil had soaked into the wood grain over months and years of daily application. The wood burned fast and hot. The factory's more than 300 windows blown out by the blast created a chimney effect in the section still standing. Air rushed through the building from every direction. The fire burned hot enough to melt cast iron radiators and iron water pipes. The temperature in the core of the wreckage exceeded anything that human tissue or bone could survive. Workers who had lived through the initial explosion and collapse were trapped under broken beams and heavy stitching machinery. Some were alive, some were calling for help. People in the surrounding streets, half-mile away, could hear the screams coming from inside the wreckage. The Campello neighborhood's district firehouse shared a city block with the factory. Its firefighters arrived within minutes. Civilians arrived with them, men and women from the houses on Main and Commerce streets who had heard the blast and felt the ground move beneath them. Using long timbers as levers, they pried sections of the wreckage upward and dragged people out from underneath. John Toig and Billy Mannix, 2 men who happened to be outside when the factory blew, ran down the street, found a ladder somewhere, carried it back, leaned it against the standing wall, and began pulling trapped workers out through the upper windows. They rescued several girls before the flames reached them and they had to retreat. Local newspapers reported many acts of individual heroism that morning. None of the rescuers were factory employees. They were neighbors. Then the naphtha went. Barrels of naphtha, a volatile industrial solvent closely related to gasoline, were stored in a wooden shed attached to the rear of the boiler house. The burning coals from the boiler had ignited the shed. When the naphtha reached its flash point, the barrels detonated. The explosion threw sheets of flame onto the wreckage, covering the debris in burning liquid. Rescuers who had been working at the edge of the collapsed building were driven back by the heat. Anyone still alive inside the wreckage was now inside a fire that was being fed by hundreds of gallons of a petroleum-based solvent. A second outbuilding, also containing naphtha, caught fire roughly 15 minutes later and exploded as well, sending a second wave of flaming liquid across the burning ruins and onto the surrounding buildings. The fire spread to a hardware store and a rooming house on the adjacent block. High winds carried embers further. The destruction expanded beyond the factory footprint and into the neighborhood itself. The engineering study conducted after the explosion concluded that without the naphtha, the death toll would have been approximately 1/4 of what it was, roughly 14 or 15 dead instead of 58. The boiler killed some, the collapse killed some, but the naphtha killed most of them. Barrels of a solvent similar to gasoline were stored in a wooden shed directly behind the boiler room of a wooden factory. No firewall, no separation, no blast-resistant container, no regulation requiring any of those things. That was the layout. That was 1905. This is one boiler, one factory, one crack in one seam that no inspector could see, in a country with 100,000 boilers of similar design. Subscribe if you want to see what else is buried in the engineering journals and insurance company files. The fire burned for more than 2 hours before the firefighters brought it under control. When the smoke cleared and the embers cooled enough for men to walk across the wreckage, the recovery process began. In the front sections of the factory, near the stairways and exits, some bodies were found intact enough to be identified by clothing, jewelry, or physical features. Toward the rear, where the fire had burned longest and the naphtha had concentrated, there were no bodies in any conventional sense. There were bone fragments, there were teeth, there were objects. The heat had been sufficient to reduce human remains to calcium powder. The medical examiner worked for days, attempting to match fragments to the list of missing workers. He managed to identify some. 18 of the dead were never identified at all. Families arrived at the scene throughout the day on Monday. The police had established a survivor registry near the perimeter of the wreckage. Workers who escaped were asked to report their names. The lists were posted publicly and updated as new names came in. The newspaper accounts describe the scene at the lists in a single sentence that I have not been able to set down since I read it. Grief-stricken relatives ran back and forth between reading the latest survivor lists and watching the recovery of bodies from the wreckage. Back and forth, between a posted name and a shape on the ground, between the hope that someone you loved was on the list and the certainty, growing with every hour, that they were not. An immediate search was made for the chief engineer. David Rockwell was at first reported among the injured. Then he could not be found. Then briefly, he was reported to have left town, which was not true. The search of the boiler room the next day produced what was left of him: a charred body, a bent watch, 2 rubber heels, a scrap of fabric. His wife identified the clothing. 39 unidentified victims were buried together at Melrose Cemetery on March 23rd, 3 days after the explosion. The ceremony drew thousands. The cortege wound through the streets of Brockton to the cemetery, where the city erected a memorial to those who perished. All 39 unidentified dead are interred beneath the monument. The 58th and final victim was Hiram Pierce. He died on April 15, 1905, nearly a month after the explosion from injuries sustained in the collapse. Police later relayed one account that I keep coming back to. A worker so dazed by the explosion that he walked away from the factory, presented himself at another shoe factory, applied for a job, was hired, and worked the entire day. He went home that evening to find his family in mourning. They had been told he was dead. He had been standing in a building that exploded around him, walked out through the wreckage, and the only thing his mind could process was to go find another factory and keep working. His name is not in the record. His family's reaction when he walked through the door is not in the record. Only the fact that he showed up at what amounted to his own wake, still wearing the clothes he had worked in all day at a factory that was not the one that had tried to kill him that morning. The Leather Workers Union announced on the day of the fire that injured workers would receive $5 per week until they recovered, and that the families of the dead would receive $100 per victim. That was the union's money. It was not the company's. Civic leaders in Brockton organized the Relief Fund, which eventually collected and distributed nearly $105,000 in cash to affected families. That money came from public donations. R.B. Grover himself was insured for $135,000 against damages that exceeded $225,000. The company declared bankruptcy. The chain of more than 30 Emerson shoe stores was assigned to creditors. Grover was financially ruined. He did not rebuild. He did not return to shoe manufacturing. He spent the remaining years of his life raising money for the families of the workers who had died in his factory. Whatever else can be said about the man, that detail is in the record. He did not walk away. He tried to pay for what his building had done. The factory at Main and Kalmar Streets was gone. In the before and after photographs, the contrast is absolute. The before image shows a large, solid 4-story wooden building filling half a block. The after image shows nothing. Rubble, open sky. The only structure still standing is the smokestack. A factory official, asked to comment on Mrs. Rockwell's statement that her husband had been running the old boiler at a pressure it was unequal to, said that the amount of pressure on the boiler was not a matter in which factory officials interfered. The engineer, he said, took his orders in this matter from the Hartford Boiler Insurance Company. If he overworked the boiler, he did it without our knowledge. We do not even know why he used the old boiler this week instead of the newer one. The company that owned the factory, that had ordered the 4th floor added, that had decided to keep the old boiler as a backup, that had scheduled the maintenance on the new boiler that forced the old one back into service, claimed it did not know which boiler its own chief engineer was operating that week. Or why? David Rockwell was dead. He could not answer. His wife had told the investigators he was worried. The company said it didn't know. The insurance company said the defect was impossible to discover. The coroner's inquest found no criminal wrongdoing. A judge ruled the explosion was caused by a hidden defect and held the company blameless. The various insinuations made against Rockwell were found to be untrue. He had done his job. He had operated the boiler within its rated pressure. He had warmed it slowly. He had checked the gauges. He had done everything a competent, cautious, experienced engineer was supposed to do. The crack in the lap joint killed him anyway. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers had been founded in 1880 specifically in response to the epidemic of boiler explosions that accompanied the expansion of steam power during the Industrial Revolution. In 1880 alone, 159 boiler explosions were recorded in the United States. By 1890, roughly 100,000 boilers were operating across the country, many of them old, many of them poorly maintained, many of them constructed with lap joints that hid their most dangerous failure mode between 2 plates of riveted steel. Inspections were rare. Operating guidelines were almost non-existent. Steam pressures were regularly cranked above rated capacity to extract additional work from aging equipment. The machines ran until they failed, and when they failed like bombs. The Grover disaster, combined with another fatal shoe factory boiler explosion the following year in Lynn, Massachusetts, pushed the state governor to demand legislative action. A board of boiler rules was formed in Massachusetts. It drafted a 3-page set of rules governing the inspection, maintenance, and operation of steam boilers. The rules were simple. They were basic. They were the first of their kind. Massachusetts passed an act relating to the operation and inspection of steam boilers in 1907, 2 years after Brockton, over manufacturer objections to what they called needless government interference. The Massachusetts Code eventually became the model for the National Boiler Safety Code adopted by ASME. 58 dead in a shoe factory in Brockton, then a 3-page set of rules, then a national code. That is what it costs to get a machine inspected properly. 58 people, 39 of them buried without names, and a monument at Melrose Cemetery. I started with a question. What does a cracked boiler seam sound like 5 minutes before it kills 58 people? The plant manager called the boiler room at 7:45 that morning to ask about strange noises coming from the radiators along one wall. That was the sound. Radiators groaning under uneven steam pressure pushed through pipes connected to a boiler whose seam was opening along a crack that had been growing for 14 years between 2 plates of steel that no inspector could separate and no instrument could penetrate. The strange noises. That was the only warning the machine gave. The assistant said everything was in order. 5 minutes later, the building was gone. Mrs. Rockwell saw her husband sitting in his chair at 7:45, hands behind his head, resting. They found his body the next day, a charred shape beneath the wreckage of the boiler room, a bent watch, 2 rubber heels, a torn piece of fabric that his wife recognized because she had washed it. America was not built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces, under 40-ton weights. And sometimes in a boiler room in Brockton, Massachusetts, where an engineer who did not trust the machine he was running lit the fire anyway because there was no other machine available, and the crack between the plates did what cracks do when nobody can see them. There are more of these stories. More machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or did not come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how the Bessemer converter built an industry on steel that carried its own flaws inside it, that video is on screen now.